everybody. It's good to see you. Welcome to North Shore. For those that might be new around here, I'm Jonathan Wolfgang, one of the pastors on staff, and so happy and honored to get to be part of this series. So welcome those of you who are here in Kirkland, and of course those of you who are joining us online as well. We're thrilled to have you guys with us. My family and I love to road trip. It's sort of our favorite pastime, and we've been all over the place, but one of the places, the trips that's still on our list is a visit to see the California redwoods, either there in Northern California or a little farther south down in Sequoia. How many have seen the California redwoods? You've been there? Yeah, quite a few of us. Okay. Well, my wife and I have been there to see them, but we have not yet taken our kids, so it's still on the list. It's hard to describe, if you haven't seen them, how massive these things are. This picture here is a picture of a tree known as General Sherman. There it is. And it is thought to be the largest known tree in the world. From what I understand, this picture, if you counted up everybody, it took 19 people with their arms outstretched to make it all the way around the base of this thing. Scientists estimate this tree is between 23 and 2,700 years old. Which, stop and think about. That means this tree was already 300 years old, at least, when Jesus was born. It's crazy to think about that. Anyway, from the outside, these magnificent trees look so strong, so sturdy, like nothing's wrong. But if you were to cut them open and look at the rings of that tree, every ring of every year would tell you a story. For instance, it might tell you a story about a year of drought when the tree barely held on and didn't grow much at all. It might tell you a story of a year of rain and plenty and growth where it grew faster than normal. You might find a ring that showed the scars of a lightning strike, or that tree had survived some sort of a wildfire. Every one of those rings would tell you a story. And it got me thinking. Many of us look so strong and sturdy on the outside. But if you could look at a cross-section of the rings of our lives, what would you see? What would the rings, what stories would those tell in each of our lives? Maybe it would tell about the time that you went through a season of deep loneliness where you wondered if there was anyone else on this planet who even cared. Maybe it would tell of a time that you lost someone or lost something, and you felt the pain of sorrow and grief. Maybe the ring would tell you about a struggle that you went through, maybe a season of depression where you just weren't even sure you could go on. Or, like we talked about last week, maybe the struggle had to do with anxiety when you just felt so overwhelmed you could barely function. In fact, maybe you're sitting here today or listening to this online and you're in one of those ring seasons right now. Because at one point or another, we all go through times when things aren't okay. I heard the story about a couple of little boys who were sharing a hospital room. And one boy asked the other, "Hey man, what are you in for?" And a little boy said, "Oh, I'm having my tonsils removed." And he said, "Oh man, you got nothing to worry about. I had that done years ago. They just give you some medicine, they put you to sleep, and when you wake up, they give you all the Jell-O and ice cream you can eat. It's just a piece of cake." And then he asked the other boy, he said, "What are you in here for?" He said, "Circumcision." And the little boy's eyes got really big. He said, "Oh man, I had that done right after I was born. I couldn't walk for a year." Sometimes we're not okay, right? Sometimes we're not okay in ways we got to go to the hospital for, but sometimes we're not okay in ways that nobody can see. Stuff that's tucked way down inside. And some of these things, these seasons only last a short time. Others, these can go on for year after year after year. But in this series, we're trying to talk honestly about what do we do when it's not okay. And one of the ways that we all experience this in one way or another is when it comes to the area of grief and loss. Now, most people, when they hear the word grief, their brain automatically goes to something that happens at funerals. It only happens at the loss of a loved one. And there's no doubt that is an important time, and grief is a big part of many of our stories. But the truth is, we all experience all kinds of losses in our lives. You can lose your job, you can lose your health, you can lose a friend, you can lose your finances. There are hundreds, there are even thousands of kinds of losses in our lives. And grief is not just for when someone dies. It's one of the things that it's for. But for many other things in life, you ought to grieve because they're losses in life. For instance, maybe you feel like you lost your childhood because you grew up in a family where addiction made your home a dangerous, chaotic place. Maybe you lost your innocence because somebody did something to you. They abused you in your childhood. Maybe you lost a dream. Maybe your life has not played out the way that you hoped that it would. And here's what I've learned, both in my life and now as a pastor for more than 2 decades. Loss in life is unavoidable. Loss in life is unavoidable. Grief, however, is a choice. See, we don't get to choose whether or not we'll experience loss in our life, but we do get to choose what we do with that loss, whether or not we're going to grieve that loss. Because when we lose something, we can hide how we feel, or ignore how we feel, or do things to try to numb how we feel. You can pretend you're okay. Or we can admit we're not okay. Why? Because it's okay to not be okay. The only path toward healing is acknowledging our not-okay-ness. And this is especially true when it comes to grief. Now, I was thinking about this whole idea of our not-okay-ness. It seems to me this week is very different from what we talked about last week. If you were with us or saw it online, last week Scott very courageously, very openly talked about anxiety and his own experience and struggle with that in his life. And we have heard from so many people for whom that was a really important talk because it's such a big issue in so many people's lives. But one of the things that Scott talked about in that message was that God does not experience worry. He is a non-anxious presence, this God, incapable of worry. It is contrary to who he is. But today's subject is completely different. Why? Because God knows how grief feels. Jesus experienced grief firsthand. You see, Jesus was not just some great moral teacher. He claimed to be God in the flesh. He never once said, no. I'm just some wise spiritual sage here with some tips on how to live. He claimed to be God himself. At the foundation of what we believe as Christians is that Jesus was fully God. Colossians 2:9 says, in Jesus, all the fullness of the deity lived in bodily form. But he wasn't only fully God, he was also fully human. Now, some people who've heard about Jesus, they've only heard stories about his miracles, the times he fed the 5,000, or he healed this person or that person. They heard about maybe him dying on a cross and coming back from the dead on that very first Easter. But there are so many scenes in the life of Jesus where we see his human side. For instance, Jesus got tired. He was napping in one of the stories. Jesus got angry. He got hungry and thirsty. Jesus got frustrated. Jesus experienced emotions just like we experience emotions because he was fully God, but he was fully human as well. And one of the things that Jesus experienced was grief. Jesus grieved. Well, maybe you've heard the story of Lazarus. It's found in the New Testament book of John, chapter 11. If you have a Bible, you can turn there, or you can go there on a Bible app. I'll also put some of the verses up on the side screen so you can follow along. And we could talk about this one chapter for weeks. There's so many ideas and important lessons woven throughout it. But today, I just want to pull out a few snapshots of Jesus' experience with Lazarus. Now, by way of background, Jesus had a group of followers who went with him almost everywhere he went. And it was a mixture of both men and women. And two of the women who followed Jesus, the Bible tells us, were named Martha and Mary. And to be clear, this is a different Mary than Mary, the mother of Jesus. There are multiple Marys in the story. There are at least 3 different women named Mary. It can get a little bit confusing. But these two sisters, not related to Jesus, Mary and Martha, they do have a brother. His name is Lazarus. And he was sick. And the story says, soon to die. So they let Jesus know about this. And the way that Jesus responds to what happens here gives us insight into how we can respond when we face loss in our lives. Here's how the story goes. John chapter 11, let me just jump right into the middle of it in verse 33. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping, he saw Mary weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. See, Jesus felt, Jesus was present, Jesus was aware. Not only was he sad to see them sad, he was sad himself, which is amazing. Because if you know the story, what's about to happen is that Jesus found out that Lazarus was sick, and he delayed a long time in going to help. They wanted to come right away and help, but he delayed. And while he delayed, what happened to Lazarus? Do you remember? Anyone here? Anyone, yes. Shout it out online. Help me out, please. Yeah, he died, right? Lazarus died. He was so dead, in fact, that when they talk about it in this story, and it's recorded in the old King James version translation, you know, the one with the these and thous and the thiths and all that stuff. When Jesus asks about Lazarus, they warn him against going to see his body. They say, this is the translation, "Sir, by this time he stinketh." Stinketh. That's a word in the Bible. Isn't that awesome? Apparently I only think so, but that's all right. Let's keep going. So they're mourning the loss of Lazarus, and Jesus is present enough to be aware of that pain, to feel that sorrow, to feel that grief. And he asks then, well, I want to see him. Where have you laid him? And they say, come and see. And the next two words give us so much insight, such a great picture into what God designed us to be and how we can handle loss. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. Two words. John 11:35. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Now, why did John include that in the story? Why do you think this needed to be in there? Because the headline of the story is this, right? Friend dies, Jesus heals, mind's blown, right? Like, that's the headline. That's the story. But he includes this little detail to let us know, I think on purpose, that if you're going through something difficult, if you've lost someone or something in your life, it's a good thing to weep. Because weeping is not a sign of weakness. And sorrow is not sin. Let me say that again. Weeping is not a sign of weakness. Sorrow is not a sign of sin. Because Jesus certainly wasn't weak. And Jesus never sinned. But he wept. In fact, it doesn't sound like this was one of those quiet cries with just like a sort of movie moment, single tear rolling down his cheek. The text seems to suggest this was an ugly cry. His cry is so intense that verse 36 says, the people who saw him weeping, even they commented on how much he must have loved this Lazarus that died. Jesus wept. He mourned. He knows what it's like to hurt, to be sad, to grieve. So before any of the fireworks happened, even knowing that the miracle would take place, Jesus wept. And in doing this, he shows us what it looks like to grieve well. Now, people in our world grieve in different ways. As a pastor, I've been to countless funerals. Even traveling internationally, I've seen the ways different cultures and different nationalities mourn and grieve. But over those years, I've seen kind of a common pattern, at least when it comes to American culture, society's pattern for grief that seems to play out often. And we learn it very young. It goes something like this. Imagine a hypothetical situation, a little boy named Timmy. He's had to put his dog down. And in that moment, what do you imagine the parents saying to little Timmy in his grief? Can't you imagine them saying, "Don't cry, Timmy, don't cry, don't be sad. We'll get you a new dog. And you'll feel better eventually." Because that's sort of the template for grief in our American culture. Don't be sad. We can get you another one. And you'll feel better eventually. And what does this little 3-part template teach us? When it comes to grief, it teaches us first, bury those feelings. Stuff them down. Don't be sad. Second, replace the loss. Distract yourself with something new. We'll get you a new dog. And third, let time heal. You'll get better eventually. So bury your feelings, replace the loss, let time heal. That's sort of the template for grief in our culture. But this example of Jesus, and frankly the teaching of this book, points to another way, a healthier way. And it's the exact opposite of the model for grief in our world. Instead of burying your feelings, God's model is to feel those things and to express them freely. Feel those feelings and express them freely. Because it wasn't only Jesus who cried or hurt over the pain of loss. The Bible is full of examples of people who cried out in their pain to God. The Bible is full of what would be called laments. A lament is a passionate expression of grief to God. Lament is the Bible word for prayers of mourning and pain. And this whole idea is a struggle for some people because they think, or somehow have been taught, they don't think it's right to complain to God. But I'll just tell you, if that's true, you would have to cut out huge sections of this book. They couldn't be included. The Bible is full of laments. In fact, there's an entire book called Lamentations. The entire book is a series of poems by a prophet named Jeremiah who is grieving over the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. The Old Testament book of Psalms, the largest book in all the Bible, 150 psalms in that book, 65 of them are lament psalms. Almost half. You think about this. This was the worship songbook of the Jewish people. They didn't have side screens in PowerPoint. Psalms was their worship songbook. And almost half of those songs say things like, "Where are you, God? Why have you abandoned me? Why do you feel so distant, so far off? Why won't you rescue me? Why won't you take away my anguish?" Those are all direct quotes from Psalms. Here's what this teaches me. You know what it teaches me? Complaining to God is not sin. Complaining to God is actually an act of worship. It's bringing our whole selves to Him, even the hard parts, the hurt, the pain, the loss, bringing all that to Him and telling Him how we feel and what we think. It is a healthy thing to complain to God. Now, most people, instead of complaining to God, they complain about God. That's not helpful. It's actually a sort of rebellion. Don't complain about God, complain to God. Because complaining to God is an act of worship, and let me assure you, He can handle it. No matter how blistering or upset the things you may say may be, God can handle your pain. He can handle your rage. He can handle your frustration. He can handle it. So complain to God. Feel those feelings and express them freely. Because you know what happens when we don't do that? When we bury our feelings, when we try to stuff them down and keep them in, it's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. I mean, you might be able to hold it there for a while. But sooner or later, you're going to get tired. And that thing's going to come shooting up, hit you in the face. If you bury the pain, if you bury the pain of that loss while it's still alive, you bury it alive, it will haunt you. Some of you have been haunted by things that happened years ago because you never grieved them. You just stuffed them down in there. I have a friend who's a counselor. He says, so insightful for me, if you don't let out your hurts in healthy ways, you will act out your hurts in unhealthy ways. Let me say that again. If you don't let out your hurts in healthy ways, you will act out your hurts in unhealthy ways. He says in his experience, ungrieved losses are often at the root of life's biggest struggles. People who've been wounded by the expectations of a parent they could never satisfy, or a parent that was absent. Wounds related to anger over something that they lost in the past but never grieved. Pain over some wound that someone else inflicted on them. And what flows out of that root are all kinds of struggles, from alcoholism to workaholism to overindulging in shopping or eating, trying to escape through sexual fantasies or encounters. At the root is some loss or hurt that they have tried hard to bury alive instead of bringing it to God and grieving it. And because our template is so rigid in our culture, this whole idea of grieving can be hard to do. We're not even sure how. Which is why one of the things we offer here at North Shore is a group called Grieve Share. Grieve Share walks through how to feel those feelings, how to express and process them, how to begin to face them instead of burying them or trying to hold them down. And it meets on Monday nights here on our Kirkland campus. And you can find out more about how to be involved in those by going to our website, northshore.church. There's a link there in the comment section for those watching online. Listen to what the Bible says about this. Galatians 6, verse 2. It says, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." Carry each other's burdens. We're here to help. And let me say one more thing before I move on. If you know someone who's hurting, and they start talking about some loss in their life, don't be a jerk, okay? Is that too direct? Was I too direct there? Did I surprise you? What do I mean? When someone begins to talk about some hurt in their life, don't try to solve it for them. Don't try to explain it away with shallow cliches. Someone dies, oh, they're in a better place. It could be worse. I guess God wanted another angel. I don't have time to talk about some of the ridiculous things that I have heard people say to others in the midst of pain. It's crazy. Actually, there's a little book you might want to check out called What Grieving People Wish You Knew by Nancy Guthrie. Just insightful little book. But let me say one final thing about this. Don't try to show you understand someone else's pain by comparing your grief to others. I know a guy whose son committed suicide. And he talked about how many people came up to him and said, oh man, I lost my mother. I know how it feels. And he'd always say, no, you don't. Not to be a jerk, not to be, rude. It's just acknowledging everybody's grief is different. In fact, here's something you can remember. If you're ever in that place, comparing never comforts. You might want to write that down. Comparing never comforts. The best thing you can do is to just shut up. Just listen. Just be there. Just let them know you care. That can mean more than you'll ever know. So the first element of this is to feel your feelings, express them freely, complain to God. The second, same kind of thing. The world's model, replace the loss. Distract yourself with something new. God's model, review the loss. Identify it. Think about it. Reflect on it. What did this loss really reveal in your heart or your life? What's making you feel so sad or frustrated or bitter? Because often our losses reveal deeper things. Maybe it's the feeling of embarrassment because you lost a relationship or a job, and it's your pride that's taken a hit. Maybe it's fear because you don't know what's going to happen in the face of some loss, or a loss of security perhaps. Maybe it's some kind of disappointment. Don't just try to replace it, to just jump to the next thing or distract yourself with something else. Don't hide or ignore it. Go there. Let yourself feel. Face it, even though it's hard. Sometimes when people go through pain like this, what they want to do, they say, I just want to get over it. I just want to get over it. And people will sometimes say, if they don't feel as though they're making progress in the way they ought, why are you going to get over this? Here's what I've learned. You don't get over grief. You get through it. You don't get over grief. You get through it. Major losses are always going to be part of your story. Quite frankly, there's some key moments in my spiritual life. We want to get past our sorrows instead of through them. And like we talked about the very first week in this series, you can't go around it. You can't go under it. I'll spare you the singing. You got to go through it. I don't think you ever get over the major losses in your life. They will always be part of your story, but you do learn to get through it. And I know this is a time of year that can be particularly hard coming up for a lot of folks to get through. In case you hadn't noticed from the fact that the Christmas trees have been for sale at Costco now for a few months, and they're probably sold out actually by now. The holidays are coming, right? And as much as we think of this time of year as being so full of joy and happiness, the reality is for a lot of people, this season's anything but. Maybe they're missing someone, grieving someone. I have a friend, I'll never forget this. She said to me, I just wish I could fall asleep the week before Thanksgiving and wake up after New Year's. That's her prayer. It's going to be a hard season to get through, which is why for the last several years, one of the things we've offered here is an experience called Surviving the Holidays. It's an environment designed for people who are grieving some loss, for whom this time of year is painful, to just come together and remember, to carry each other's burdens, as Paul writes in Galatians. It's on Sunday, November 17th at 2 p.m. here on campus. Sunday, November 17th, Surviving the Holidays. And some of you need to be there. You need to invite friends and family to come. Again, there are details on northshore.church if you want to find out more. So instead of burying your hurt, feel your feelings, freely express them, complain to God. Just like Jesus did when he wept. Jesus didn't sneak off and cry privately. He wept for all to see. Second, instead of replacing your loss, review it, face it, be honest about it, reflect on it. And finally, instead of hoping time will heal, invite God to heal the wounds of your loss. I know for some of you say, God's the last person I want to talk to. But friend, if you want to grieve this, I urge you, invite God to heal the wounds of your loss. To just say, God, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do next. I'm stuck. I'm tired. I hurt, God. I don't know what to do. And I don't understand this. But honestly, even if I did get an explanation, I don't think it would make me feel any better. I'm hurting. And I need you to heal my wounds. And one of my favorite verses in the Bible is Psalm 34, verse 18. It says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Maybe it's just this little verse that you've now memorized. You memorized a verse today. John 11:35. Jesus wept. He gets it. He knows what it's like to lose, knows what it's like to hurt. In fact, the New Testament book of Hebrews says later this way, describes Jesus as a high priest who is able to empathize in our weaknesses. Hebrews 4:15. He gets it. He's not some distant, aloof God who isolates himself from pain and loss, as many people tend to do. He comes near. He knows how it feels. He gets it. And he gives us this promise. Jesus himself speaking here. He says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." This one who knows what it's like to mourn, to weep. He says, even in the pain, you will find comfort. In fact, in the pain, you might even find blessing. So what sorrow are you feeling today? What loss are you struggling with? Maybe it's one that's causing your eyes to spill out right now. Maybe it's one you're working so hard to hold down like that beach ball. Whatever it is, you need to know Jesus gets it. He knows how it feels to lose something. He knows how it feels to mourn, to grieve, and he promises to be near. And Cheryl Linders is a member of our worship band. She plays very regularly. In fact, she played last week. Incredibly talented keyboard player. And she's one of the sweetest people I think I've ever met. But what you may not know about Cheryl is she knows what it feels like to hurt and to grieve. And she very courageously sat down with our team to talk about what she learned about this God who promises to be close to the brokenhearted and who comforts those who mourn. Listen to what she has to say.
Well, we'd been going to North Shore for about, I think, around 5 years or so when our son Michael was diagnosed with leukemia when he was 2.5, and he's our youngest of 3 boys. And it was quite a shock for us, and he went through treatment for a number of years. And 6 years later, when he was about 8.5, he passed away. I just had no way of being prepared for that kind of loss, even though we knew for about 6 months that it was probably going to be the inevitable. But we were crushed. I'll be honest and say that I was a mess. I cried most of the time and just really struggled to keep going. I had been a Christian since I was about 8 years old and grew up in a Christian home, but when this event happened of losing our son Michael, I really hit ground zero again, and I had to struggle with my faith at that point. I remember being so fragile and so broken and so hurting. I just didn't know if I'd be able to get through this in one piece, and yet God showed himself faithful. Our church here at North Shore just came alongside us and loved us through it and kind of became the arms and hands and feet and mouth of God and allowed us to somehow put one foot in front of the other. Worshiping the Lord has been a huge gift in my life. And when I was going through the darkest days of my grief, I had to make a really critical decision of whether I could still, in that dark grief, worship the Lord with my whole heart. And as I made that decision to worship God no matter what, he was able to meet me there. And it was an expression for me of admitting and proclaiming that God is God and I am not. He's taught me that pain and sorrow can coexist with a sense of joy and peace in the Lord, and that it's okay to be hurting and to have pain, but knowing that Jesus is big enough for anything. He's there through every step of the journey, even if the grief is deep. God is there and he's with me through everything.
You don't get to choose whether or not you experience loss in life. But you do get to choose whether or not to grieve it. Whether to bury those feelings or to feel them and express them. Whether to try to replace that loss or distract yourself from it, or to courageously face it. Name it. Whether to just hope that somehow, magically, over time, things will get better. Or to invite God to heal those wounds. Now, I think if you asked Cheryl, she'd be able to tell you. You never get over a loss like that. Some of you know. You never get over a loss like that. But God's helped her through it. And so here's how we're going to end. As Cheryl referenced, I want to give us a chance to be reminded of the hope and healing we can have from God. Because some here know how it feels to cry out to God in the middle of your loss or your grief. We're going to have a chance to practice that. We're going to sing together a song that was actually written in the midst of deep grief and deep pain. You can hear it in the lyrics. It articulates what many of us have felt. And I'm going to invite you to make a decision to reach out to God even in the middle of your pain. But I know there are some here, you just can't do that today. And I understand. I get it. It's okay to not be okay. And maybe as we sing, those around you sing, maybe your courageous step today will be to just let yourself feel, to review that loss, and to somewhere find the courage to even begin to bring it to this one who gets it, to ask for his healing. So will you bow your head with me right now? Because I know there are some in this room who are just hurting so deeply. For some of you, this wound is so fresh, so fresh. For others, that pain, it goes way deep into some inner ring of your life years ago. But it still hurts because it was buried alive. All of us knows what it feels like to be wounded. And so God, all of us come to you and thank you. Not for the pain, not for the loss, but for this amazing radical idea that you get it. That instead of running away from pain like most people do, you instead run close. You offer to hold us. Because you know how it feels. Because you were fully human. And yet, God, we also acknowledge that you are fully God and that you proved it when you not only experienced the pain and suffering of others, you endured pain and suffering yourself on a cross. And you showed yourself greater now by walking out of the tomb. You proved that even our pain, our loss, even death itself do not have the final word. That you are greater. And so we cling to that hope. And we ask you to come near, to count every tear, to hold us as only you can, to comfort. Thank you for your promise to be near to the brokenhearted. So Lord, come now, be near. In Jesus' name.